These days, the phrase form follows function has become a kind of religious mantra in the design world, and everybody gets taught it at university. But here's why following it blindly is going to make you a terrible designer. You see, when we design things like this, they might appear to be really efficient, but there's a catch, and that's because function isn't the be-all and end-all. So let me give you an example of this. Imagine that you need to go on a long road trip and you have 3 cars in your garage to choose from. Car number 1 looks great, but it doesn't actually have an engine, so you can't drive it anywhere. Car number 2 drives well, but it's quite temperamental, and so you're worried that it actually might break down on the way. And so this leaves you with car number 3, which is the most reliable car of the lot, but it's so ugly you don't want to drive it. So you don't take any of the cars, and you hire one instead for your trip. And so this is the point. The most functional design of car here gets about as much use as the car without an engine. So you might kind of think of this as a scenario where aesthetics serve some kind of important part of the car's function. Like, for example, the car needs to be attractive so you can show it off to your friends. And maybe you think that form should go before function, but there's a far better way to think about this kind of chicken and egg problem, and it comes from this Roman architect called Vitruvius. See, Vitruvius used what has become known as the classical triad, which consisted of 3 elements. First of all, utility. Can I drive the car? Second of all, durability. Will I always be able to drive the car? And thirdly, delight. Do I actually want to drive the car? Do I want to show it off to my friends? And will I enjoy driving the car? And effectively, any design that doesn't have one of these 3 qualities is essentially functionless, because for one reason or another, it won't get used. And when we start considering things from this perspective, the idea of form follows function just begins to fall apart. And here is a great real-world example of this tried at work in architecture. You see, the industrial buildings that were constructed in London and Manhattan during the 18th and 19th centuries were initially used as factories. However, their attractive designs resulted in people actually caring for them. And so then when industry moved out of town, buildings were actually converted into luxury apartments. Now, can you imagine the same thing being done to any of our modern everyday buildings? No, absolutely not. And the funny thing is, so many of our ugly modern buildings attempt to be good for the environment, but the reality is they'll never quite be as good for the environment as these more classical buildings. Buildings that people actually want to look after, repair and reuse for hundreds if not thousands of years simply because they're so attractive. When the lifeless modern buildings that dominate our towns and cities are no longer needed, they'll simply be demolished. Then a new building will just get put up in their place that will serve a new function. And like many people, perhaps I'm looking back at these older buildings with rose-tinted spectacles, and maybe we've actually just demolished all of the old ugly buildings to be left with the most attractive ones. And sure, maybe this is the case, but I think there's actually been a war on decoration and delight and aesthetics for the last 100 years or so, and I think it started around 1913 when Adolf Loos wrote this essay called Ornament and Crime. You see, like the other Adolf we all know, Loos was another quite questionable person, and in his essay Loos proposed that decoration was a primitive activity that the modern man was now beyond. He thought that the people of the future would be so much more rational and that they'd prefer much more clean and simple designs. However, Loos ignored the fact that despite our modern technology and our great new civilization, our human brains are still hundreds of thousands of years old, and we've got this kind of evolutionary hangover that you simply can't ignore. You see, we actually evolved to like the look of things that were good for our survival, and that has nothing to do with how functional your website design might be or how clean and minimalistic a building facade is. And so to assume that functional design will naturally be found to be attractive is just kind of ridiculous. Either way, Loos inspired designer after designer to come up with these kind of utilitarian ideas like form follows function and less is more. And today the practice of designing things that everybody finds attractive has kind of been forgotten. And I think this is probably partly due to the fact that a lot of people think that everything's subjective or that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, which is just not true. And for a quick example of why that is, you can simply look at the sky-high prices of old drafty townhouses versus the much lower prices of very highly insulated, well-made new builds to see that a lot of the time people will put form before function. At the end of the day, 99% of the design around us is completely pointless, and if we wanted to, we could survive in a prison cell on bread and water, but we don't. Because as the old saying goes, man cannot live on bread alone. And so we must be designing things for our pleasure. And if we're going to go to the trouble of designing anything, why don't we try and make everything attractive? And this is why the classical triad is so important, because we've become so modern and so overly rational that we've dismissed aesthetics and decoration, when in fact these things are fundamental to something being functional long term. Anyway, so many designers are staunch minimalists and they sit on the other side of the fence to me about this kind of idea of form and function. So if you like this video and you know somebody like that, send it to them and see if you might change their perspective a little bit. And there's so much more I can get into in terms of how aesthetics affects our brains and how you can build a much more impactful brand cross-culturally. So hit the subscribe button and the bell to get notified the next time I upload.